Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are tackling the ultimate economic puzzle. Who gets what and why? I mean, think about it. Every single day, businesses run, land is leased, people go to work, and money flows all around the globe. But how do economists actually make sense of where all that money goes?
Before we get into the heavy economic theories, we really need to frame the discussion with a simple yet totally profound question. Who actually gets what and why? Is it just random? Is it strictly based on how hard you work? Or are there underlying invisible economic principles dictating the flow of all this capital? Well, today we're going to unpack exactly how economists have answered this question over the centuries.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the two main approaches to income distribution. Review the classical theory and its flaws, introduce marginal productivity, learn how to measure it, and finish up with the theory's real-world limitations.
Okay, let's dive right into part one, approaches to income distribution.
To begin solving our puzzles, we actually have to define the word distribution itself, because how you define it completely changes the entire conversation. First, we have personal distribution, which focuses purely on the size of income between individuals. This is the realm of modern wealth inequality debates, how to make the rich a little less rich and the poor a little less poor. But then we have functional distribution. This examines the factors of production and how they are individually rewarded for their specific roles. For our explainer today, we are zooming entirely in on this functional side of things. Moving right along to part two, the classical theory. To really understand functional distribution, we have to travel back in time to the classical economists, like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. They looked at the economy and systematically mapped out four main factors of production, proposing natural rates of reward for each one. It goes like this. Land earns rent, labor earns wages, capital earns interest, and enterprise, the organizers bearing the risk, they earn profit. It wasn't really one unified framework, but rather a patchwork of specific buckets. For example, David Ricardo poetically defined rent as the portion of produce paid to the landlord for, and I absolutely love this phrasing, the original and indestructible powers of the soil. He argued that rent wasn't earned because a landlord actively went out and improved the land. Not at all. Instead, it was simply a surplus left over after the basic costs of cultivation, like labor and capital, had been met. Which brings us to part three, flaws of classical economics. So those classical theories were a bit fractured, and they had a glaring flaw. They couldn't explain exactly why profits arise for the entrepreneur in the first place, and this brought about a moment of major narrative tension in economic history. Thinkers like Karl Marx looked at this system and claimed that labor was actually not being paid for all it produced. He argued that a surplus was being kept by capitalists, and that constituted their profit. It was a massive indictment that basically painted the whole capitalist setup as inherently exploitative. So, how did the field respond? Let's look at part four, enter marginal productivity. To counter those heavy critiques of capitalism, modern economists sought a totally objective, mathematical basis for distribution, essentially to prove workers weren't just systematically exploited. But get this, the pioneers were actually split on how to interpret their own new framework. On one hand, J.B. Clark developed this as an objective theory of distribution, a way to definitively prove that factors like labor are paid exactly what they contribute. But on the other hand, Alfred Marshall viewed it primarily as a theory of demand, showing how a firm decides how much labor or capital to hire based on the prevailing market price.
Let's break down how this actually works in part five, measuring productivity.
Imagine we are stepping right onto a factory floor. Let's say it's a ready-made garments factory. First, we have average physical productivity, or APP. It's super straightforward. Total output divided by total workers. So, if 10 workers make 100 shirts, your APP is simply 10 shirts per worker. Easy enough, right?
But here is where things get really interesting. Marginal physical productivity, MPP, looks strictly at the change. If you add an 11th worker to that exact same assembly line, the extra shirts that only that specific new worker adds to your total output is your MPP. This single marginal concept is quite literally the beating heart of modern distribution theory.
Of course, workers aren't paid in shirts, they are paid in cash. We have to translate physical units into actual money, and we do that by multiplying them by the product's price. So APP becomes average revenue productivity, and crucially, MPP becomes marginal revenue productivity. According to the theory, to maximize profits, a producer employs a factor right up to the exact point where its reward perfectly equals its marginal revenue productivity. It's a neat mathematical balancing act.
But is it really that perfect? Let's check out part 6, the theory's limitations.
As elegantly as this theory works on paper to tie wage rates to marginal revenue, it rests on some frankly highly questionable assumptions. It assumes perfectly competitive markets where no single buyer or seller influences wages. It assumes labor is entirely homogeneous, meaning every single worker is identically skilled and perfectly mobile. It also assumes that factors of production can be varied in tiny, completely divisible quantities so we can perfectly measure those marginal changes.
But let's be real, the actual world is messy. Think about a multi-million-dollar steel plant. You can't cleanly add or subtract a tiny fraction of a blast furnace to perfectly measure its marginal productivity. It's fundamentally indivisible. This leaves us with a pretty provocative thought. While we have these incredibly sophisticated models to understand who gets what, can a truly perfect theory of distribution ever exist if massive parts of our economy simply cannot be cleanly divided? Keep that in mind the next time you think about the true measurable value of your own work.